Hi, and welcome to Organizing the Chaos with a Workload Placement Policy. I'm John Burke, CTO at Nemertes, and I'm here with Nemertes CEO and founder, Johna Johnson, one of my oldest friends. And thanks for joining us today. Before we dive into the content, I want to encourage everybody to submit any questions that they have along the way by using the Bright Talk control panel. Should be off controls off on your right-hand side. I think there's a big question mark for you to press, and also check out the attachments along the way to find ways to connect with us. And with that, I'm going to dive in. And today we're going to be talking about what we mean by a workload placement policy and why you should have one, what to fold into a workload placement policy, and after that, building off that in a way, beefing up your workload onboarding processes. We'll wrap it up with recommendations, and we should have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. So launch questions early and often. Thanks very much. So what do we mean by workload placement policy? It is fairly straightforwardly a policy that defines goals, or if you've already set them somewhere else, incorporates goals for using various sourcing options, a private cloud or your data centers, if you're not putting on airs and graces about what you do in that data center, your use of infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, SaaS, and any other sourcing options you care to take advantage of. Setting criteria for determining when a workload should go into which sourcing option, and we'll dig into that in considerably more depth, and establishing a uniform process for placing the next workload you place in the right place. And when I say uniform, I'm talking about applying the policy to every workload that you place so that you're making the same choices with respect to each workload. And that you're doing it not just for net new jobs when you're spinning up some new thing that the line of business has asked for, but also when you are refreshing or replacing an existing system. And one of the key benefits of this is that it makes these kinds of placement decisions transparent, so that everybody can see the criteria on which you are making the decisions, the priority of those different criteria with respect to each other, and the reasoning by which you arrive at your conclusion is all out in the open. And this can save lots of going back and starting over when folks question why things are going the way they're going. In the end, it should allow you to make your final decision faster. It should allow you to make all of your decisions with respect to what goes where more consistently. And it should help all of those placements that you make serve your higher level goals in IT. And it's important to consider these decisions as you make them for where to put each thing as, yes, another small push towards achieving whatever the goals of IT are with respect to its support of the business and the business's goals. And we've got a whole other set of webinars on setting goals and building architectures and frameworks and roadmaps to push IT in the right direction, to push the business in the right direction. That's a webinar for another day.
Well, and I'd just like to add before we jump to the next slide that there's another hidden value of having a workload placement policy, which is CYA. Because at some point, somebody's going to ask why a workload lives in a particular spot. And that particularly comes in when it's, why did you move this to cloud? Or why did you not move this to cloud? Or why did you move this to that cloud? And it's super helpful to be able to point to the workload placement policy and say, because this was our policy, and we reviewed it with you 6 months ago and you agreed to it then. So I'm just following it. So like a lot of documentation, it serves a good downstream CYA benefit. I love this slide because, number one, I'm a geek, and as John said, this is fun for various definitions of geeky fun. But it's also really, really logical. The basic concept behind a WPP is that it's a decision tree for placing workloads in different places. It can start simple and rapidly evolve into taking into account a lot more factors. So here is an example of one that we developed for one of our clients. So step one, here's any random workload. Do any of these things apply? The contract requires on-premises execution of that workload. A security policy requires it to be on premises. Well, if the answer is yes, your question is solved. Deploy that in your data center. Or is any of the following true? The architecture is cloud unfriendly. In other words, it's huge, monolithic, rarely used, no scale out, no sleeping. Cloud latency is going to be unacceptable because it's very latency sensitive. The cost in cloud is more than X% higher than the cost in the data center. Again, all of those things will tell you keep it in the data center, don't move it to cloud. If none of those apply, the next question is there a specific external cloud tool required for the work? Is there a specific requirement, et cetera, such as FedRAMP? If the answer is yes, then obviously deploy it in the cloud that really requires it. If not, another question to ask is that application sending a lot of data into a specific external cloud? Once again, if it's sending a lot of data into that cloud, you probably want to put it on that cloud. In this particular case, the client had a pre-existing definition that administrative applications had to go into Azure. So if it was an admin job and it didn't send a lot of data into a specific external cloud, that one went to Azure. Otherwise, it went to either AWS or Azure based on prior use cases or any available templates that they had for that type of app. Now, I just want to stress, this is an example. This is not the end-all and be-all of a workload placement policy, but it shows you how that it quickly helps you make decisions about what workloads go where.
And I think it's probably worth stepping into just briefly the sort of, well, duh factor that you sometimes get when you walk through this. And folks say, well, of course, if the contract calls for it, we'll do it. But I am reminded of those checklists that surgeons follow when they're doing an operation on somebody. And, starting with, am I clear on what organ I'm removing from this person?
And left side or right side, yeah.
All those, well, duh questions. Why are they on the table in front of you for an appendectomy if you're not taking their appendix out? But in point of fact, walking through the checklist makes sure that everybody in the room is on the same page with respect to what's going on. It's the same with these kinds of decisions in a workload context. Just because, well, duh, the contract calls for it to be in the cloud doesn't mean that everybody's always asking themselves, is there a contract requirement in place for this workload?
Exactly.
Or is there a compliance requirement that applies to this workload? And sometimes, they put it where it doesn't belong, and then they have to claw it back and put it where it does belong.
And I want to highlight another well duh now that you bring it up, because in a very real sense, your workload placement policy should drive your cloud strategy. And that sounds backwards. You're like, no. I want my cloud strategy to drive my workload placement policy. But no, because if your cloud strategy is, as some of our clients have, put everything in cloud, then you're just basically doing an end run around a workload placement policy, which makes no sense. You're saying that regardless of the safety, efficacy, compliance, security, performance requirements, we're just putting it in cloud. That's actually kind of dumb, and you don't want to do that. So even if your cloud strategy is cloud where you can, on-prem if you must, the workload placement policy then kind of gives you a deeper level of detail into what it really means to must or can.
Exactly what it means to can. Yep.
Yeah.
So what we saw when we were doing research on this prior to the pandemic, so this was 2020, really late 2019, early 2020, before the stay-at-homes began. Most organizations had at least begun to use a workload placement policy and process to drive their placement of their next workload. And on average, they were putting about a little over half, about 56% of the new workloads coming their way, they were putting them through that process. And that suggests that some big fraction were getting the well, duh treatment and not going through the formal evaluation, or that they were coming in over the transom or under the door slot and not getting proper process to begin with. So there was still a lot of progress to make there. And they were also doing just under half of the refresh workloads that they were deploying. This was happily associated with a 42% speed up in returning to normal service after an outage on one of their standard services, what we call the mean time to normal metric. And the most successful organizations were 21% more likely to have a WPP in the first place, and they would have they were at that time applying it to 50% more of their refreshes. So more like 65% instead of 47% of their refreshes. So good evidence indicating the importance of having a WPP in place and following a process based on that policy. What we saw during the pandemic in conversations with our clients and research with others is that so many organizations sort of took a drop everything, get it into the cloud approach, whether it was replacing an on-premise system with SaaS or lifting it and shifting it into the cloud in IaaS, that they sort of put the WPP on hold. As Johna was saying, they let their cloud strategy, their short-term and not necessarily well-considered cloud strategy, trump having this process in place and following it. And to the extent that they did this, they did get a lot of workloads moved into the cloud, a lot moved into IaaS, even when it was a really bad place to put that workload. And there weren't a lot of real operational benefits for having it not on premises. It just sort of got swept up with the things where there was an operational benefit. And we did see and do see still a lot of sticker shock and people seeing their IT budgets balloon in unexpected places, sort of a budgetary aneurysm that is getting ready to burst and destroy their budgets. Because when something's not well suited to running in the cloud, it will cost you, anywhere from 30% more up to run it in cloud. And when I say up, I mean up to 2, 3, 10 times as much as it costs you to run it on premises, depending on the nature of the workload. We also saw performance shock, and they continue to see that where things don't perform the way they expect them to anymore, whether because of just the variability in internet performance and delivering packets over best effort networks, or because of the effect that has on integrations with other tools. They're just not seeing the kind of performance that they expect to and need to. And sometimes also process shock. They shoved all these things out into the cloud, but their operations processes, from the admin team all the way out to the NOC and the SOC, haven't really fully been brought up to date with that large scale shift into cloud and that unplanned shift into cloud. So we think this is a good time to be talking about this again and getting folks to consider recommitting to doing things the right way in the first place. So when we talk about a workload placement policy, when we talk about a workload placement process, we mean for it to be, if not comprehensive and considering every possible aspect of a workload and its operations, to at least be broadly based, looking at more than just cost, especially, and with respect to cost, looking at cost in some detail. So we expect to see, and most folks do consider cost and performance in one way or another. The thing is, almost without fail, there was no single point that most folks were considering. They would be looking at application performance, perhaps, but not internet network performance, or they would be looking at the cost of storage, but not the cost of security. So we see that there's a big palette, and folks have been picking and choosing the things that they consider to be most important for them at the moment. And we encourage folks to take a broader approach to things and to take more of these factors into consideration, especially more of the cost factors, but also more of the performance factors. And things that are not directly related to the platform, like how long do you expect this application or service to need to be in service? Is this something that's only going to exist for a couple of years and then it's going to be tossed out? Or is it something you expect?
Famous last words.
Is it something you expect to be running for the next 10 years? So yeah, and no joke, famous last words. Of course, there are billions of lines of COBOL out there running right now that nobody ever thought they'd need 60 years after they first wrote them. But there they go. And of course, there are considerations that were not such a major consideration at the time we did this research last, like geolocation. And this is something that a lot of our clients are currently wrestling with. What happens if, as was the case, a little over a year ago, we need to suddenly change how we're doing business with Russia? Or what if we need to change how we're doing business with China? And when we say how we're doing business with, we don't just mean buying and selling. We also mean providing IT services to those parts of our company operating in those locations or in those regions. So where in the world something has to be, and that's sometimes a data sovereignty issue. You can't take this data out of the country. And where things must not be, again, sometimes a data sovereignty issue or sometimes an operational consideration. Those are things that everybody should have on their roster of considerations at this time.
Yeah, as Meta just found out to its detriment, I think it was like a $1.6 billion fine from the EU because they illegally transported data into the US. Those basically, we were all wondering a couple of years ago whether GDPR was going to have any teeth, and I think we just found out.
Big teeth, big teeth.
Big sharp teeth. Okay. Well, when John and I were going through these slides, I asked him to remind me what the definition of success is for cloud operations. And what's interesting is I remember when we put this definition of success together, because why do people move things to cloud? Largely because they're trying to gain resilience and agility. And that's actually what our success definition is. As John alluded to a little bit earlier, successful folks are the folks with the shortest time to recover from any kind of outage or issue. So the assumption is moving to cloud makes your infrastructure more robust and resilient and agile because it's more responsive quickly. So that's what we used as our definition of success. And what we found is that the successful folks had applied WPP to more of their existing workloads than all others. 63% of their workloads versus 38% for the all others group. They also were more likely to consider a whole slew of additional factors. John talked about the cost of storage and security and data movement. They also looked at things like application performance, resilience of data centers, both their own and providers, the costs of the OS and the hypervisor licenses and the compute resources, as John mentioned, the expected lifespan of the application and the application's architecture. And one of the really fun things about a WPP is that there's actually an infinite number of things you could potentially consider. So part of the act of defining one is deciding which ones matter to you. And here at Nemertes, we have certainly asked our research participants and clients which ones matter to them. We also have our own ideas as IT practitioners, which ones ought to matter. There we go. But all of us together can really come up, working with you, working with our clients, can come up with a list of things that are fairly common to consider. And it's worth noting that the more successful folks are considering a greater number of factors.
And I think you can sort of see how to draw the line between considering all these things before you put a workload someplace and your ability to restore it to proper operations if something goes wrong, because you're likely to have a much better understanding of the workload in the first place and of the potential problems that it might experience and of the features that are available in the application or in the system that you're running it in to recover from those errors. So it makes a lot of sense to us logically that going through this process with more of your workloads, considering more of these factors, makes you more resilient at the business level. And what we actually saw, if I remember properly, it's been a while since I've looked at the stats, is that the folks in the success group had 2 orders of magnitude less downtime.
Yes,
From their applications.
It was really significant. It was like, from 100 minutes to 1 minute.
Yes, but they had almost an order of magnitude more incidents that happened. It's just that they made them very, very short. So they would be down for a minute or 5 minutes and not for 2 days. And again, that's about the foreknowledge and the preparation. So that leads me directly into this follow-on idea that we were talking about beefing up your onboarding processes. Because once you've gone to all this trouble to figure out the right place to put something, it's great if you can do a better job of putting it where it belongs. And this is something, again, where your operational processes around cloud way too often are not as robust as your operational processes in your own data centers, because it's far less likely, or has been far less likely, for folks to wind up running applications in their data centers without knowing who the main stakeholders of those applications are, and escalation paths when there's some kind of question that needs answering and your primary stakeholder is not answering the question, what kind of SLAs you're supposed to be delivering on that workload, what the security and compliance and audit requirements around it are. Knowing these things and documenting these things as a part of the process of putting a new workload in the place where you've decided it goes, and not just in your data center, but everywhere, is another contributor to success. And we saw that the folks who are most successful are somewhat more likely to have a workload onboarding process like this. And we did see that it was more robust as well. And one of the pieces that is most important is that the more you understand about how you're supposed to be configuring things for your workloads as they flow into different environments, the more you can automate about that configuration. And so we saw that when folks had one of these processes in place, that they were adding automation around security configurations in the data center and in the cloud, network configurations in the data center and the cloud, and even image construction and configuration for the VMs that get deployed in IaaS or in data centers. Pretty good adoption, but none of these numbers was above half. So again, lots of folks picking and choosing which ones they were working with the automation on, and leaving most of the rest of them lying by the side of the road. Whereas we saw that.
And yeah, I think John is handing off to me. Most successful organizations do more of the automation. They are far more likely to automate things like security configuration, both in the data center and in the cloud, for resources and for networks, and also network configurations in the cloud and data center, and VM and image configurations. And John, did you freeze there, or are you just sitting really still?
I was just sitting really still. I try not to fidget continually.
Yeah, exactly. But you never know with video. So basically, I think one of the big takeaways here is that if you want to be successful, you should have a WPP. You should have a workload placement process built out, an onboarding process built out following the WPP, and you should include automation wherever you can. And I think you're just about to say that with the wrap up. And here we go.
I think you anticipated a bunch of it. So yes, indeed, have a policy and a process, and apply them to everything new coming in, as well as to what you're doing refreshes on. And even if it seems like a well-duh situation, walk through the process and see if it should be a well-duh, or if you actually have options that you hadn't considered because you just hadn't been walking through and asking yourselves the questions. Yes, firm up your process around workload onboarding, especially for cloud, and including much more robust and wide-reaching use of automation for those workloads, and really for all the workloads that you've got in all the different environments that you're operating in. And let me see. Okay, so before we get to the Q&A, excuse me, and you still have a chance to.
Gosh, I think John went away there. So as he was about to say, you still have a chance to plug in your questions. Please go ahead and register for the upcoming webinar. So you want to be a CISO. This is your full life cycle guide to becoming a CISO and what to do in the beginning, middle, and end. Welcome back, John.
Thank you so much. Happy internet to everybody.
Yes, right. So I just talked about registering for the upcoming. You want to talk about some of the previous webinars to go watch?
Sure, and thanks so much for picking it up smoothly. And yes, we have also in the channel right now things that we've done recently. One on automation from a recent Bright Talk Summit. Can't live with it, or can't live without it. Got to learn to live with it. And what is quantum computing actually good for? That's one that you and I did together, of course.
That was a fun one, yes.
It was, and it's just going to get more fun as there's actually more real quantum computing out there. And if you work in enterprise IT, we would love to have you join our private online community that is specifically for technology professionals. Simply fill out the short application form on our website. The URL is right there, and you can get to it from the homepage. And fill in Bright Talk webinar when it asks you where you heard about the community, and we'll get you hooked up and get you plugged in. It's a fun place, and it's a place where people get the jokes you tell if you're in IT.
This is true, actually. So we'll keep this slide up here while we take some questions. John, here's a good one that came in. If you haven't, this is the first I've been hearing of a WPP and why I'd want one. Where should I start?
Well, I think a great place to start is with some of those well-duh issues. Like, is there a contract that applies to this workload? And are there security requirements that require this workload to be in a specific place or not be in a specific place? Starting with those two kinds of considerations, whatever the version of that is for your industry, will get you thinking in the right direction. And then thinking about whether you have preferences for specific cloud environments and why will help you frame the set of questions that you need to ask to determine whether things should go in there or should go somewhere else. And that should include things like, what else do I already have running in there? So is there sort of a center of gravity for certain groups of applications already formed in your use of cloud? And what are the environments into which a lot of data is flowing, because I probably don't want to make a huge amount of data flow out of those because egress costs where ingress almost always doesn't. So that's another good consideration to take into account. And then I'd like to suggest to folks that they consider softer issues like which environments do we have more staff depth in, and which environments will take less of our staff time to deploy things in. Those are not the same question, and they're important questions. Where are our skills and where do we get the most leverage? And those are also some considerations that folks should take into account.
Well, and that's a great answer, John. That leads into the last question, next and final question, which is, are there, I've noticed that that this is essentially a flow chart. Are there any tools I can use to start inputting all these decision points into the tool so that I can get my flowchart built out?
There should be in a lot of environments now something in the way of a cloud service broker, a vRealize type tool that lets you, push button deploy things into environments if you want. But you can also just, put out the form that an end user would fill in to get something placed and ask the questions there that the workload placement policy dictates. And instead of actually pushing it out into that environment automatically, if you're not operating at that level yet, you can at least spit out the decision. Failing that, any kind of low code, no code environment might give you a simple way to run up a decision tool that would basically embody the flowchart for you and let you answer questions and get a decision out. Failing that, good old Excel, you can do all sorts of things with just conditional formulas and drop-down lists and so forth.
Excellent. Well, I think that does it for the questions that we've got. So thank you for listening. And I think we have a couple of attachments that folks can go connect to. John, do we not have a report associated with us? I believe we do.
Don't know that it's linked. It should be linked by now, but I'll apologize and say I haven't checked the links to see if it's in there. It should be there. We do have a report on this topic.
If it's not there on Bright Talk for some reason, just go ahead and hit us up on that contact form that John mentioned on community and ask for it. We'll happily give it to you. It talks about all this and much more.
Indeed. And with that, we are at a wrap. Thanks so much for your time.